Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Pedophile Huntress. Tonight is a very special podcast for me. I have a special guest. His name is Russell Stagg. He's written a remarkable book. I've read most of it. It's called One in Six, and it's a guide actually for men who have been sexually abused. So much of everything that's out here is for women, and I'm just so excited to have him here with me. I'll have all of his credentials, his book and that sort of thing in the comments. So if you want those things as we get done and as we move forward, I'll make sure that we have that all here. I'm going to start with Russell, and Russell, I'm going to let you just go ahead and introduce yourself. And there's many things. Your book has so many things that validate men. I'm just so proud and honored that you took the time to be here tonight and to discuss this with us. But if you'd start with why you wrote this book, what you do for a living, and just kind of introduce yourself to the listeners.
Okay, well, thank you, Jody. First of all, thank you for having me on the show. So, my name is Russell Stagg. I'm a psychotherapist in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada. I'm licensed in 3 provinces. I'm a psychotherapist, and I'm also a survivor of child sexual abuse. My work on trauma has been published in major psychology journals, and my research has been cited 4,000 times.
It's remarkable. I love it so much. Um, were you finished or were you?
I can start talking about my book if you'd
Well,
like.
one of the things, I'd like to actually start. There were so many remarkable things, Russell, honestly, that I want to talk to you about. But I really wanted to start your story with this one. It's in your book and it's on page 17, and you say, along the way, there were many serious challenges, but the evening of April 24th, 1990 was my turning point. The day my recovery journey started, the moment my life changed forever. Can you bring us into your life at 1990 and tell us what was going on, what was happening, and what made this pivotal moment in your life?
Wow. Okay. So, yeah, at that point in my life, I was underemployed. My marriage was falling apart. Uh, I just couldn't connect with people. I had tremendous social anxiety. Um, and I knew something was seriously wrong. I didn't really understand what it was, but I knew something was wrong. And one day I was just in a shopping mall. I passed a bookstore. I went in. And for some reason, I picked up a book called Adult Children of Abusive Parents. And I felt tremendously guilty picking that book up. Um, and so I bought it. I took it home. I hid it in a sock drawer. And 3 days later, I took it out one evening when I was alone, and I started reading it. And I just got to the first line. Like you, I was abused as a child. I totally lost it. I just lost it. Like I was finally admitting to myself that I had been abused. Um, and I was curled up on the floor. I was just sobbing. I sobbed all night. I cried for months. And I got into therapy. I got into 12-step programs, but it was as if all that emotion had been dammed up.
Yeah.
And in an instant, the dam broke. And there I was, just crying and crying for my lost childhood.
And isn't it remarkable that the words like you I was abused. You write quite a bit about the emotions and why we don't remember. Um, I hear this all the time. I always tell people if you think you've been abused, you have been abused because people just don't say, "Oh, I think I've been abused." But it's funny how many people say, I kind of think there was something because our fragmented memories come through
Mhm.
often. So
Yes.
talk a little bit about, so here you are, you're married. I don't know if you have children at the time, but in your book, you talk about your drinking. I don't know how much, but clearly we all love to drink because it blocks our memories, it stops our mind, our emotions. So it's 1990. You read these words, and it's like somebody doesn't ask us the right question, right?
Yeah. So the at that point, I guess I knew that I had been abused, and that was about it. I couldn't put any kind of a face to that. Um, but I had always remembered um, being when I was alone with my mother as a child. She was naked,
Mhm.
and that was kind of strange. And I had memories of helping her to take her stockings off and, helping her take a bath and things like that. And I guess as I began to sort of accept that I had been abused, I started to fill those memories out.
Mhm.
I had always had this really strange emotional reaction when I saw people wearing nylon clothing. It's like, wow, it seemed incredibly erotic to me. And it dawned on me, I don't quite know how, that that was actually a memory.
Right.
I was remembering my mother's nylon panties
Mhm. I
that she had made me take off.
Right. They're
Um,
triggers. Yeah,
yeah,
it's fascinating how they work.
yeah, that was a trigger, and but I
Mhm.
couldn't place what it was. And
Mhm.
then, of course, it's like, oh my gosh, now I remember.
Mhm.
It wasn't, gee, I wonder what it might have been. It's like, oh, that's what it was.
Mhm.
Um, and then that memory led to another that my mother had made me take my clothes off and get in bed with her. And then it led to another memory of her pushing my head down under the covers. So it was interesting. It was just one memory after
Mhm.
another. And the trigger had been this really strange emotional reaction to nylon clothing.
And what do you think precipitated you to allow? Was it that book that you read that you finally said to your mind and your heart, I'm going to allow these memories? I find, I talk to a lot of victims, and as they move through life and they're 20, 30 years down the road, which is often when many of us recover these memories, there has to be this triggering event where we say we're going to allow it, right?
Yeah, the turning point,
The turning point. And so
the moment your life changes. Yeah.
I love that you say it like that because when I was in a very abusive marriage and my children were little, I didn't have memories either. Although I had those fragments that would come through
Mhm.
all the time. I
Yeah.
knew something had happened in this motel room. We have these fragments, but we don't give any time. We give time to only deny them and push them back down. Right. And so I think it's
Yeah.
interesting that you say one memory opens another memory, opens another memory. And it's very true because we can have this fragment of a memory that we've given no emotion to, right?
Mhm. And something happens. I think it's almost to give yourself permission
Hmm.
to think, wait a minute, maybe that memory has something to do with Well, in that case, it was with my mother.
Exactly.
And then as I realized it fitted in with that scene
Mhm.
with my mother in the bedroom helping me take her stockings off, it's like, oh, there it is,
Right.
right
I
there.
and I love that because you talk about that children can actually have a sexual arousal and being groomed correctly, they should make us, unless you're so little that there's just it's painful because that was my experience, but they can definitely arouse you. I've heard many people say that you're aroused because we're sexual
Uh-huh.
beings, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so that delivers a lot of shame, and it's hard to bring then those emotions back to that scene because if we keep the emotions away, it can just be this weird story somewhere that's in a shelf on a closet in the back room, right? But when you take
Hmm.
those memories down and then you feel those, it opens up all the emotions. And I loved when you wrote about, I'm not looking for the story as much as I am the emotions in my patients. Talk a little bit
Hmm.
about that. I thought I've never really heard anybody put it in that term because mostly people, right, are trying to get away from emotions or coming through abuse and pain. We put our emotions in a belt only to be taken out when we need them, that kind of thing. I thought that was fascinating that you said that to get to your emotions. Talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so as a therapist, a client will be talking about something, and all of a sudden, I notice an emotion, and it's like, whoa, we have to grab that because you can tell yourself all kinds of things. You can lie to yourself, but your emotions don't lie. And somehow or others, something they just said
Mhm.
caused a
It's
realization that they had reached the truth. There
it's
was
it
something very important there.
exactly. I love that. It's very true. And I think a lot of times people can deny what they think that they're seeing, but you
Mhm.
cannot deny the emotion tied to it, right? Like I've
Yeah.
gone through some really strange experiences in my life. I love the book now that we all know The Body Keeps the Score. There was this time in my life when I started, both of my arms had this strange aching. And I was in counseling for years and years and years, but I couldn't figure it out. I went to see this physical therapist, and he said, "Well, Jody, actually, your arms wouldn't hurt in the area you say they're hurting." In the middle of the night, Russell, I woke up and I saw that my mother was straddling over me, and I was very small. I turned 4 in the big house, so I was probably
Mhm.
3.
Wow.
And there it was. And as soon as I got that memory back, my arms, the next day they were fine. It was so weird. And they hurt for 6 or 7 months. I mean, I can't even tell you how long. It was very strange. And I also had an experience come back in my body where my ankle hurt this one time when my father was raping me as a child. He had held my leg in such a way that really probably sprained my ankle. And my ankle hurt forever until that memory came out. So these memories are they need our body's experience with them, right? And I think
Hmm.
that's what the
Yeah.
emotion is it's our body's experience with it. The mind cannot house everything, right?
Yeah.
And
The body remembers.
the body remembers. I think that's
Yeah.
so beautiful. It's really true. And you said another thing I thought I'd never really heard it this way. But you talked about during the grooming process, you said on page 9, child molesters make you think you have a choice. That
Hmm.
that
Yeah.
that's there's such wisdom in those words because I've talked to people that are my friends. I've talked to people, out doing this work. And you know what they say? Oh, well, I had a choice, but I wasn't getting love at home. She was 9 years old, and this is really
Hmm.
what
Yeah.
this woman believed. So, talk a little bit about that. I think there's a lot of wisdom that people get stuck in the tragedy of they're complicit in the crime.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. This is something I've struggled with too, that
Mhm.
I really have to, I'm a therapist now, so I can think clearly. But I look at what happened to me and I really have to struggle to be objective and tell myself, wait a minute, you really did not have a choice there.
Exactly.
you couldn't have done anything else given your situation and your age. But it's really hard to do.
It's incredibly hard. And I noticed that people, abusers are so good at making that complicity, that we're part of this act. And it's fascinating to me. And I think that people often don't step back into their memories because of that guilt. It's like we're feeling the guilt of the perpetrator. You know what I mean? Like I watched my father
Mm-hmm.
murder
Oh
this
yeah,
woman, and for years I'd say we killed her. And my counselor would say, Jody, you've got to stop saying we. But I
yeah,
turned 4 after that murder. And so everything in me believed we had done that. We left the room alive. We cleaned up the room. We went and buried her. It's the
yeah.
same thing with any childhood crime that we witness, right? We're child witnesses to these things, but we don't call them crimes, do we? We call them,
No,
I don't know,
no.
we call them family nuances, or it's odd to me that people don't call incest a crime. It's a crime.
Yeah, yeah, it is.
It's a crime. And so if we get to this place where we can delineate that these are not family matters, these are crimes that are occurring, and to heal people and speak the truth and that sort of thing. I'm curious because on my YouTube channel I put up asking people what they'd like me to talk about. And somebody said family, the complications around family relationships. So I'd like to talk to you about that for just a minute about it's your mother, right? And so now it's
Hmm.
1990. You're going to go back into this memory. Do you believe you have to confront? I didn't read that in your book that, about going back to your mother. Talk a little bit about that relationship and what did healing look like there for you?
Okay. So the first thing I did was no, I did not confront my mother. Well, I kind of did. I just wrote her a letter and said, I'm not going to talk to you. I'm not going to correspond with you. I'm not going to have anything to do with you ever again. And she died, oh, I guess, what, 7 years later. Um,
Mhm.
I didn't go to her funeral.
You didn't. So you
And
guys did
I
not
had
discuss this then.
no. And, um, with my clients, they really struggle to
Mhm.
separate themselves with family.
They do. I mean, I've
And
seen many people.
yeah, and I encourage them to just do it.
Mhm.
Like, don't worry about confronting them because what will they do? They will try to make you doubt your memories. They'll try to make you think you're
Mhm.
crazy. They are not going to change their ways. If they give an apology, can you really believe it? And so on. And
Mhm.
I just decided, okay, I'm cutting loose, and I still think it was the right thing to do. I
Yep.
haven't regretted that.
I have to tell you, I think the same thing is true. It's a trigger to be around them. What people don't understand is, to be around my father, or, my father abused me from being little, tiny, to I left his home, and then it turned into sodomy because then I wouldn't be pregnant. And, my mother actually was in those rooms. She sometimes would read a book. Like it's such strange things, but to go back, it's there triggers all around you. You have to leave who
Mhm.
you are and who you're trying to become outside the door. So I think there's
Yeah.
a lot of wisdom in telling your clients to stay away. But I notice I'm hard pressed to understand why people have such a hard time making the separation. What do you think that is? Do you think it's the grooming, the trauma bonding with their parents, what do you think?
I think that abusers are really good at making their victims feel guilty.
Mhm.
It's part of what they do. So, people have told me, well, if I cut her off or him off, I'll feel so guilty. And, it's hard to convince them that, wait a minute, they're adults. They can look after themselves. It's really
Mhm.
important for you to look after yourself. And we were raised to always be thinking about other people, including the abusers. So uh, we feel guilty when we do something that's going to upset them.
Mhm. It's so true. You stated it perfectly, but that's very hard for people to see themselves. I always say, you see you, take your eyes off the abuser, because when your eyes are on the abuser, right, then you're just looking at their life, you're looking at their guilt, all of these things. And I think people want this apology. And the truth is, well, an apology might be good. My father apologized for the murder on his deathbed. I still had a lot of healing to do. That didn't, you know what I mean? It doesn't take you to this
Yeah.
place of euphoria where, woo, I'm all done now. And, I mean, I really, I was to translate that into my life, it really didn't affect my life that much. It was great to hear I'm sorry, but maybe that was because he was just dying. You know what I mean? He never said he
Yeah.
loved me, because love doesn't live with these people. I
Yeah.
agree with you that there is a statistic, I don't have it with me right now, but they are one of the lowest number of rehabilitated people there are. And
Yeah.
I think it's because they're just so broken to ever, especially your own child. Incest to me is one of the worst crimes, I think, that are perpetrated against children, because it's such a violation of everything good and
Yeah.
reasonable, right? And in one of your patients in your books actually said, I knew, or was this you? I can't remember. I knew it wasn't love. When my mother was doing this to me, I knew it wasn't love. I
Yeah.
thought that, I
That's me.
think,
Yeah.
but that, I think that it struck me because, I knew that too. But when people become adults, Russell, they change it to modify it to say that it was love. Have
Hmm.
you experienced that at all, where I thought that I knew that my parents didn't have love for me either, and yet my father intricately wove this design in me that I would believe he loved me. But in my heart, I always knew he didn't, because love wouldn't act like that, right? So
Hmm.
I determined I'm just going to look for kindness in life, because kindness is different than love, right? Because love was very complicated. So why did you know as a child that, when I read that, it just struck me that children have a wisdom that we don't build on, right? And how come you knew that as a child, that it wasn't love?
I think we had pets. So, I loved our pets. And so what I felt with my mother was, it was, I guess, disgust, really,
Hmm.
that what she was making me do, that uh, it did not feel right, and it did not feel loving. So, the baseline I had was, the love between a child and a pet.
Got you. So outside of that, your grooming with your mother, she didn't build that kind of loving relationship outside of those, you know, uh, sexual acts?
No, no, absolutely not. It was,
Oh, okay.
and I think with boys, it's often different, that that they don't get that kind of, you know trying to build some kind of relationship. It's in my mother's case, it was just control.
Oh, interesting. And so I've always wondered about this. My mother gave me much more rejection than my father did. And I always wondered if it was because the sight of me made her remember who she was. I couldn't help but think that my father had no problem with it at all. But it's a very unnatural act when it's your mother, right? And my mother made me do things that, similar to what you've said about your mom. And I always wondered if it was hard for her or something. I don't know. She rejected me a lot. I never got anything from my mother. She was always very far away from me. And
Mm.
so that's interesting. It could be because mother perpetrators act differently. What's your opinion on that? That's curious to me. I've never thought of it in that way until you said it.
Yeah, I know with my mother, she really went out of her way to put me down,
Hmm.
to criticize me. She would set me tasks that were way beyond my abilities, and then she'd criticize me for being stupid and clumsy, and whatever. It was pretty much constant, and that was part of the abuse too.
Oh, 100%. That sounds very much like my mother. Yeah. There is not a lot of kindness in this. One of the things I really liked about your book was how much you talk about the statistics that are wrong. And one of
Mhm.
the things that you said was in 1988, The Courage to Heal came out. And me and my girls both, I married an abuser, unfortunately. And so I had the task of trying to help my children with the right tools to
Oh,
heal from that as well. So the
wow.
Courage to Heal, they actually called it a Bible. We had it laying around our house.
Mm.
But one of the things you noted that I had never even thought about, Russell, was this is a book that talks about women. It was designed for women. It's built for women. It has nothing to do with men. Although your numbers are quite clear. There are millions. And if we do the real numbers, right, 1 in 9 don't even report. So of those that report, that's 64 million survivors, but we know men are not coming forward like they should. So that
Mhm.
number is even less. So talk a little bit. I loved all the stats in your book because there's a clarity that you bring around how many men survivors there are. Just chat about that for a little bit if you would, because you're going to do a much better job than I could.
Okay, so the statistics are stunning, and
They are stunning.
people have trouble with them. They refuse to believe them. And I say, look, I'm taking numbers from the largest scale, most reputable surveys ever carried out. You don't like these numbers, take it up with the CDC, take it up
Mhm.
with the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, take it up with these renowned authors of these large scale studies. I'm just the messenger here. But like, for instance, one statistic that I pointed out is somewhere between 43 and 48% of sexual violence is perpetrated against males.
Mhm.
Um, I point out that basically males are experience sexual violence at almost the same rate that females do. That at least 40% of child sexual abuse is perpetrated against males, and it's probably higher than that. I point out that most sexual violence toward males is perpetrated by females. And
Mhm.
that is something people will try to argue with me about.
Mhm.
And I just say, look, don't argue with me, argue with them, argue with those authors who did those massive
Mhm.
surveys with tens of
Yep.
thousands of people. Argue with them, don't argue with me.
Mhm.
And, I also point out that roughly a third of sexual abuse of boys is perpetrated by mothers.
Yep.
So, mother son incest is the most common kind of sexual abuse of boys. Um, of the male clients, I've had hundreds of them. I had, I think, one who was abused by a coach, one who was abused by a priest.
Mhm.
So, that's what people think. They think, you know, that it's these sort of institutional abusers. They get all the press because you get lawsuits with lots of money with those kinds of
Right.
people. But in actual fact, most, or probably at least half uh, of sexual abuse happens in the family.
That's exactly right. I loved that. I think that you're spot on. I talk to people all the time. There is so much mother incest and female, criminal sexual abuse that goes on. It's phenomenal, but I think it's far easier for society at large to listen to. It's outside of the home, it's down the street, it's the neighbor. For some reason, incest has carried such a taboo. I think it's one of the darkest things on this earth. It starts destroying people from childhood and it carries that through to the very end of their life. It's like a perfect crime of hell, but people don't want to look at it. You're right. And so I really honor your statistics. I went through those and I wasn't alarmed. Actually, I thought this is the truth because
Yeah. Well, you
it's
talk to these people,
yeah, I talked to
so
him.
you
And so
know.
I knew
Yeah.
this was the
Yeah.
truth. Right. I
Yeah.
knew it was the truth. You also talked about a statistic about prison rapes. I
Hmm.
loved what you brought up because, again, we have it all wrong in our mind. We think it's man on man. So talk about
Yeah.
that statistic because I don't want to say it wrong. I don't have that in front of me. Go ahead
Okay.
and share that because I thought in that, again, we have it wrong in our minds.
Yeah, it was the now I hope I get it right. The National Bureau of Justice Statistics, I think it was in the United States,
Hmm.
published this lengthy report of,
Hmm.
and I think it was like tens of thousands of uh, uh, inmates. They were looking at adolescent inmates, I think. But they found that 84%
It's wild.
of
Hmm.
sexual violence against male inmates was perpetrated by female guards.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I just think that society, it's easier for them to comprehend that. You know what I mean? It's the Madonna syndrome, or I don't even know, but it's fascinating to me when you start talking to people and you get them to tell their stories. Your numbers are right. I know they're right. But the
Mhm.
problem is that men have not talked about these. And we have so many men and women who are destroying themselves because it's like what you said. If we don't allow our stories out, we're living at half mast at best. We're probably living with a quarter of, you know what I mean? Like you just cannot live because I read this book years ago and it talked about the congruency between the left and the right hemisphere in our brains. And they took this group of people and they said, tell me a secret. And one of the things that you've never shared with anybody, and immediately there was a congruency between the two halves of the brain. And this book was fantastic. But what it said was you're using actually part of your mind to suppress and hide these memories. And
Yeah.
so we're constantly depressed. We're constantly don't know who we are, right? We're not living our authentic self because we're living this made up version of what we've done to carry on. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh boy, I'm sure that's true. I would have to, I think, refer to my life. Um, that I think when we're doing that, sometimes the emotions come out, and when they come
Mhm.
out, it's like that's the breakthrough we need. And I think in my book I talked about how there was uh, my mother was she involved me in a group that was creating child porn. It was in
Right.
a small town in England. And I've talked to people about it, and they said, yeah, we actually see a lot of this kind of thing. But um, when the memories started coming back, they really didn't make much sense at first,
Mhm.
and it was an experience many years after the first memory started coming up. I was in a hotel room and I was watching, it was, just a crime drama on TV, just made up stuff. And at the end of it, they were leading the hostages to safety. And there was a woman police officer leading a little girl. And I just lost it.
Mhm.
That was a memory. That was a memory that in this group that was whatever making child pornography, there was a girl there. And I hadn't been able to rescue her.
And those are huge. When I read that in the book, it struck me as well because often the lack of justice in these crimes, we don't know what justice is. I did a podcast once where I had some women on, and it still breaks my heart. It brings tears to my eyes. And I asked them, "What does justice look like for you?" Do you know, Russell, there was just silence.
Mm.
And I understood it so well that we move on in life without justice, right? That lady that my dad
Yeah.
murdered is still up there on his property. Well, they believe me, they need a confession. My father's gone now. But what about all these crimes that happen to children, right? We are witnesses, we are the evidence. But then we grow up and we don't say anything. Nobody's there to help us. And what does justice look like? When I read that, I so related to it because often people don't understand when we see these kinds of films and there's this great justice at the end, our
Yeah.
hearts want to explode with grief,
Yeah.
right? And you talk
Yeah.
about those stages, and there's so much grief around the lack of justice that we've received, right? They honestly, and then all of a sudden, after awkward silence, they started saying things like, well, I guess living a good life. I mean, honestly, that was the only way that they could articulate what justice looked like. So
Mhm.
that's a profound emotion, a lack of justice, right? And then again, that guilt for not supporting her. I know that siblings often feel this. I've talked to many of them that come from homes of incest and they couldn't protect their siblings. My older sister came to me and apologized for that. She said, I didn't know what was dad was doing. Well, she couldn't do anything because again, these perps that
Yeah.
make us believe that we have some kind of power here, we have no kind of power,
Mm.
right? We
Right.
don't. But again, those triggers are happening all the time. And I think wisely, like you just shared, we need to move into those and allow those, right, to come out with us because I think it's so true. One of the things that you talked about too in your book I thought was so well done. Because again, people can study us, Russell, but if they haven't lived it, they can't understand it. And your distinction between PTSD and anxiety, I thought was so good. I want you to talk about that. I had to pick and choose the things because I could talk to you for hours because you just
Right.
articulate it so well. Because I had a counselor that I adored and I was with him for well over 15 years and he changed my life profoundly. And I would tell anybody, get in good counseling because when flashbacks would come, I thought it was this woman's spirit coming to me. And he helped me understand what a flashback was. Tell me where you saw her, Jody. PTSD is not anxiety. It can feel like
Right.
anxiety, but it isn't. And I really want you to share with the listener because so many people I know don't go to counseling. They just hide in their rooms. They won't even follow our shows because they're too shameful, but they'll listen to them. So I want you to talk about and articulate as a survivor the difference between PTSD and anxiety. I thought you did such a beautiful job.
Okay, so in my book, I started out with, the sort of thing that I would deal with in therapy. This guy was in a car accident. And as a result, he was absolutely terrified to get behind the wheel. He'd just be perspiring and shaking. His wife would have to take his hands off the wheel when they arrived at their destination. He took safe driving classes. He watched videos about how to be safe. He bought the safest car he could, and he's talking to me about what a mess his life was. And he said, "Do you think I have PTSD?" And the answer was no. And some people might say, but look, this guy was just, he'd been in an accident, he'd had trauma, he was just a total mess. But everything he did was focused on the present or on the future. What might happen? That is not PTSD. That's anxiety.
Mm.
PTSD is focused on the past. And so then the second anecdote I gave was about a young man who'd gone to university. He came from a ranch, and he didn't interact much with anybody. He took classes online, and so it was pretty daunting for him to be in the big city. And he went to visit his aunt, who was it was his father's younger sister, who was she was much younger. She was paying for his university education. And so she showed up in I guess it was a nightie or something, and plying him with alcohol. And she took it off, and then told him, well, if you want the checks to keep coming, you're going to have to please me. And he was a total mess. He would hear a voice that sounded like her, and he'd just have to get away. He would see a face like hers, and he would just freeze. Um, Everywhere there seemed to be reminders. Everything would trigger these reactions in him, um, that would feel like anxiety, but he was actually reliving something that had already happened. So that's what PTSD is. It's a time machine that takes you back to the past.
I I love that distinction because today I hear so many people interchange PTSD and anxiety. And
Mhm.
it's sad because people that live with PTSD, it's a very different thing. Anxiety can be very strong, and I'm so sorry for the listener that deals with that. But I loved the distinction that you made. And you talked about, it really is reliving and going back into the past. And you gave some clarity around what you could do. There's been times in my life where, because the murder was so strong, I mean, everything, I am not undermining at all sexual trauma because I lived much of that myself in childhood. But I watched this movie one time and this woman's throat got slit in the movie, and that my father had done
Ooh.
that to this woman, and I froze. It's a very hard thing when you're there because you talked about you're there. You talked about some of
Yeah.
your PTSD. This is not like I'm feeling anxiety about going back to that memory. You're actually transported, like you said, in a time
Yeah.
machine. You are
Yeah.
there, and I was frozen up against that wall as a child. And so I'd like you to just tell the listener what you can do in those moments because you had some really cool things in there that I hadn't thought about. I actually had my daughter happen to be there that night with me, and I asked her to call the therapist I was seeing at the time. And very gracefully, she walked me through that, because memories come back as snapshots, and we went through this whole thing, and I'm safe now. But talk about some of the things that you can do when you find yourself now, not in anxiety, but when you are back in that moment and you really it feels like I'm 6, I'm 4, I'm 10, I'm 12, and I'm stuck. Talk to the listener about what they can do.
The, it's really important to try to stay in the present because you've gone back to the past. So one of the first things you do is you look around. What color are the walls? What color's the floor? You name 5 things you can see. You name 5 things you can hear. You keep looking for what you can see, what you can hear. Maybe you can smell something, and so on. And just really anything you can do to stay present. If it's really hard, you can, suck on a lemon or, ice cubes or listen to really loud music. I've had clients who did that. But absolutely do every possible thing you can to stay in the present and not go back there. Because in the present, you're safe. It's in the past that you were in danger.
And that's a very hard distinction to make. The one thing that I was very early in my healing at that time. My daughter's now almost 40 and she was still living at home. I did not have those tools, and it was very frightening because I was really stuck there. I loved when you said grab a lemon, grab an ice cube. Having lived through that kind of lived experience through PTSD, I just love that. I'd never had anybody tell me that before. And I thought, oh my gosh, sometimes today, because we can never completely rid ourselves of these things and triggers and that sort of thing. People like to think there's a nirvana. I have a real
Yeah.
expectation that, like my counselor said to me, Jody, I can't tell you that when you're 80, something wouldn't come back, because we had years and years of trauma that we lived through. But I loved actually thinking about because I have so many tools, but I did not have the lemon or the ice cube, Russell, I have to tell you. And sometimes, I get that weird feeling like my body's going back and is going to get stuck. And I loved that. That's just kind of a cool thing. I'm like, I'm taking that forward with me in life because it'll quickly go because those are really real things. I mean, they can be terrifying. People don't understand why people will all of a sudden. Yeah, I'm a CASA worker here in Montana, and I watch these children who have lived trauma, and they get a trigger and they freak out, and people do not understand what's happening.
Yeah.
And I can relate, right? Because it happens when you're 43, 62. You know what I mean? Like it just really happens. So anyway, I just think that your work is so outstanding. I like to give the opportunity for you, since you took the time. I know it's late where you are. I so appreciate you being with me. I had a full work day, but this matters very much to me. And I know that listeners are out there and I know they're listening. What would you like to share with the viewer that's just on your heart tonight to share? I want to give back some time to you to talk about anything that we haven't. Your work is phenomenal. I think that's so cool, that you're helping these people, because it's kind of like an alcoholic needs an alcoholic to tell him how it is. I think a survivor can really reach out and share in a way that people listen to. So, Russell, I'm going to just give you back the last few minutes to share anything that you'd like to share that you think we didn't touch on, because there's so much to talk about.
Oh my goodness. Gosh. Uh, we've talked about PTSD, and I think one thing I would like to say about PTSD, most people, when they think about PTSD, they think, oh, that happens to people with combat experience. Well, it turns out that fewer than 1% of people with PTSD have combat experience. And
Fascinating.
that's basically what you hear about in the media.
Mhm.
The number one cause of PTSD is sexual violence. And I have had clients say to me, no, I can't have PTSD because I wasn't in the military.
Right.
And, it's a misconception. And I think it's important to get past that. The biggest cause of PTSD is sexual violence. And so I see an awful lot of it in my practice. Um, and,
Again, right, the stats in your book are phenomenal around that, and it is so true. When I read that, I was like, "Really?" Because even I thought, I love that the Vietnam vets actually taught us a lot about, PTSD. They did, because they weren't doing well when they came back. That book by Judith Herman, Trauma and Recovery, such a good book. But she talks about that, and they taught us a lot, and we started looking at trauma and how it affected us. So I appreciate that work and that, but it was so funny that, again, like you say, 1%, because look at that. I mean, you
Mhm,
think about the population and the billions of people, it makes sense, but we're not seeing these stats right.
mhm. If you're a survivor of child sexual abuse, you don't really have a before to
Exactly.
compare what happened. Uh, so, these people who went to war, they had a before and an after, and they realized, well, things have changed. But if you had child sexual abuse, you don't have that. You don't realize what has happened to you. And oh yes, here's something that I think might be very helpful to people to know is I have people frequently say to me, I overreact a lot.
Mm,
And what I tell them is what's happening is you're not reacting in the present, you're reacting in the past.
mm,
You get triggered and you don't realize you're getting triggered because you don't have a picture of what's happening, but you feel the emotions you felt during that trauma. So something, totally innocent could happen. It's like I think I mentioned in the book, somebody had an overdraft at the bank or something,
mhm,
and it was just overwhelming for
mhm.
them because they thought they did something wrong. And what did that relate to? Being abused by a babysitter, they thought they did something wrong. And it just took
Yes.
them right back.
It does, and I think that's fascinating when people, it's like the missing puzzle piece. If you think there's something missing in your life, there is. You know what I mean? These fragments that come back to people. I always tell them, start with the one fragment you have and stay with it and allow it to be authentic in your life, because it is like what you say. It's remarkable. We're reacting to something we don't know. That's what you just said, and that's a very people don't talk about that very much, right? It's these hidden agendas that are trying to be worked out in our lives that we don't understand, but there's this visceral reaction that's quite strong and it's alarming, right? But we don't
Mhm.
know what would a person do if they have that? Because I know many people have that. Like, I'm overreacting. I have this, why am I reacting in this way? Like you just mentioned when we earlier about that kind of material that made you respond in a certain way. What should a person do to start exploring that? They should stop and explore it, right?
Right. So what I do with my clients is, if it's say a feeling of shame, for example, I would say, okay, think about when in your life you felt shame, and when was the first time you can think of that you felt that shame.
I love that.
And another thing I'll do is I'll ask them what other feelings they have around that, when they feel these that they're overreacting. And it's amazing how often people will say to me, I was feeling this, but I felt small. It's like,
Mm,
bingo. You felt small because
mhm,
you were back there.
mhm.
And that is something, when someone says I felt small, it's like PTSD. There you are. You're having a
Mhm.
flashback. That feeling of being small, it's so often goes with that, and it's a real clue that yeah, this isn't about the present, it's about when you were small. And
It
so
is,
all
yeah.
I can do is invite people to think about that emotion and where it came from, because it probably came from something that happened when you were, very young.
Oh, it's so true. This has just been such a wonderful time chatting with you. I'm going to put all of Russell's links to his book and a description, obviously, in this. I'll also cut this into pieces and put it on TikTok. It's quite popular out there because people are in such need of these conversations. We all work so much. Russell, thank you so much for being here. You've just been I just feel so honored that you took time out just to help people and give this wonderful information because this is just such great information. I'll be in touch with you and I just thank you again so much. Is there anything else that you'd like to say? I think that we've just said so much. It's wonderful tonight. It was a lot
No,
that we
it's
covered.
yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Keep up that good work. And everybody out there, you remember to see yourself this week. You see you. Take your eyes off the abuser, and I'll see you next time. Good night.